Welcome to Season 3, Episode 11 of CSS Breakdown, book by book. In this chapter of Michael Kimmel's The Gendered Society, we turn to the private sphere, friendships, love, and sexuality, to explore how gender shapes our most intimate connections, not by nature, but through nurture, culture, and expectation.
Yeah, it's a really important shift, isn't it? Because, we talk a lot about gender out there in the world.
Right, the workplace, politics, that kind of public stuff.
Exactly. But this deep dive, it pushes us right into the most personal bits of our lives.
The places we think are natural, instinctive.
Precisely. Friendships, love. Kimmel really wants us to look closer to see how those gender norms we learn, how they shape everything, even how we connect.
Peeling back the layers, like you said.
Seeing how society, not just biology, molds these bonds.
Okay, so to really get into that, let's start with how we usually see these things. Our culture. It's full of ideas about men, women, and intimacy.
Oh, absolutely. Think about those famous lines from poets, like Lord Byron.
Man's love is of man's life a thing apart. 'Tis woman's whole existence. That one.
That's the one. Or Robert Browning saying, love is so different with us men. These aren't just old poems. They reflect this really deep-seated belief.
And novelists, too, right? Doris Lessing saying she never met a man who'd wreck his career for love, but never met a woman who wouldn't.
Exactly. These cultural touchstones, they kind of unconsciously shape how we think about emotions and relationships based on gender. They set up these different expectations.
It feels almost baked in sometimes. You hear it all the time, don't you? Women complaining their partner doesn't open up emotionally.
Or men wondering what their wives are talking about on the phone for hours.
And the classic one, a man having an affair and saying, oh, it's just sex.
Right. As if you can just neatly separate sex and emotion. But how often do you hear a woman say that about her affair?
Almost never. It's a really stark contrast.
And all these common ideas feed into what Kimmel calls the interplanetary theory of gender.
Ah, yes. The men are from Mars. Women are from Venus's idea, basically.
Pretty much. Women are the emotional wizards, the communication experts. Men are, well, the strong, silent types. Maybe a bit emotionally clumsy. As if it's just how we're built or where we came from.
Oh, and this is the key point Kimmel makes right away. The actual differences we see, they often don't match up with these stereotypes.
Not at all. Or at least they're not nearly as big as the different planets idea suggests. It's a major challenge to that whole narrative.
So while men and women might express things differently sometimes.
The idea that these differences are huge or biologically fixed just doesn't hold up well under scrutiny. And what's really fascinating is that the way we see gender differences now, say, in the U.S., it hasn't always been this way.
Historically different. And different across cultures.
Exactly, which strongly suggests these aren't timeless biological truths. They're outcomes, results of social changes, historical shifts.
So this deep dive is about tracing that, how friendship, love, sex became, well, gendered.
Precisely. How historical and social forces shaped all of this, not just our biology. It's about society's hand in our hearts, really.
Okay, that sets the stage perfectly.
Yeah.
Let's start with friendship then, because the historical picture is, well, it's kind of the opposite of what we might think now.
Right. It used to be that men's friendships, their way of loving, were considered superior.
Seriously, superior.
Oh, yeah. Think ancient Greece, Rome, Renaissance stories. Male friendships were celebrated as the absolute peak of virtue. Bravery, loyalty, heroism, duty, all seen as masculine traits expressed best between men.
So like Achilles and Patroclus.
Yeah.
Or David and Jonathan from the Bible.
Those are perfect examples. For the Greeks, philosophers like Plato and Aristotle even argued friendship was nobler than marriage. It required equality, you see, which in their world meant, well, it meant men.
Because women weren't seen as equals.
Wow. It implies only men had the emotional depth for those really profound bonds. That was the thinking.
And this wasn't just ancient history, you're saying, it carried on.
It really did. Look at American culture. Huck Finn and Tom Sawyer, Butch and Sundance, Cook and Spock. The list goes on. This ideal of deep, almost sacred male friendship runs deep. Walt Whitman wrote about the dear love of man for his comrade.
Even Montaigne, the essayist,
wrote about his male friend using language most people today would use for a spouse. And C.S. Lewis, much later, pretty much treated friendship as a men's club.
Okay, but what about women? Did prominent women buy into this?
Surprisingly, often yes. Mary Wollstonecraft, a feminist pioneer, called friendship the most holy bond, but thought men did it better. Simone de Beauvoir, decades later, felt women's feelings rarely rise to genuine friendship.
Why? What was the reasoning?
It often came down to this perceived lack of strong emotions in women, supposedly preventing them from forming those deep, idealized bonds that men were thought capable of. It shows how powerful that cultural idea was.
But then things changed
Yeah.
dramatically. You mentioned around the 1970s.
Yeah, a huge shift started then. Two big things happened. First, feminism really took hold and started celebrating women's emotional expressiveness, not as a weakness, but as a strength, a source of connection, solidarity.
Okay, so women's way of connecting started being valued more,
Exactly. And at the same time, you had this men's liberation movement starting up. Psychologists and others began looking critically at the traditional male role,
saying it was what holding men back.
holding them back from intimacy, yes. Suddenly, that stoic ideal was seen as a barrier. People started saying men needed those qualities previously labeled feminine, being expressive, vulnerable, nurturing.
Yeah, a complete flip. So men went from being the friendship experts to being emotionally deficient.
That's pretty much how the narrative shifted. The sociologists talked about men's trained incapacity to share. Psychologists warned that men avoiding self-disclosure was actually bad for their health. The idea became that men's emotional lives were weak and often absent.
And they identified reasons for this. Barriers.
They did. Robert Lewis outlined 4 key ones. First, competition. Hard to be truly open with someone you feel you're competing against.
That makes sense. What else?
Second, the false need to be in control, always appearing strong, never vulnerable. Third, homophobia, which we'll definitely get into more later, a massive barrier for men.
Okay. And the fourth.
Just a basic lack of skills and positive role models for male intimacy. How do you learn it if you don't see it or practice it? All these things basically encouraged men to keep their guard up.
So fast forward to today, and the perception seems to reflect that reversal. Surveys often show women feel their friendships are deeper, more about sharing feelings.
Well, men's are seen as more activity-based work, sports, doing stuff together rather than just talking.
And that common response from men when asked to compare, I hadn't really thought about it.
Yeah, that response itself kind of reinforces the stereotype of detachment, doesn't it? One sociologist, Daniel Levinson, concluded that for many men, close friendship is notable mainly by its absence. The line between friend and acquaintance gets blurry. Many men lack that truly intimate male friend or even a close female friend who isn't a partner.
It sounds quite lonely, actually. So for you listening, does this description ring true? Your own friendships or those you observe? Or does it feel like the goalposts have moved?
That's the question, isn't it? Have we just redefined friendship and intimacy using more feminine benchmarks? This whole idea of the feminization of love suggests that maybe men's ways of being close are still there, but we just don't value them or even see them the same way anymore.
Because they don't fit the current definition.
Exactly. It makes men's styles seem problematic or invisible.
It's a powerful critique. And a lot of research does seem to back up the stereotypes women talk. Men do.
Some even look for biological reasons. You know, the fight or flight idea for men under stress testosterone driven versus women's tend and befriend oxytocin driven seeking social support.
But Kimmel is skeptical about relying too much on biology here, right?
Very skeptical. He suggests men's reactions might be less about hormones and more about learned masculinity needing to appear strong in stressful situations, and women seeking allies. That could just be a smart, rational strategy.
He uses that thought experiment, doesn't he? Imagine reversing the roles.
Yeah, Sharon Brenn's idea. Picture Jim and Henry staying up all night, pouring their hearts out about love and life, or Sally and Betty spending hours tinkering with Sally's car engine.
It sounds weird. Unconventional, at least.
Right, and that feeling of weirdness tells us something. It pushes us to ask, is it really about one gender having shallower friendships? Or do men and women just build that same intimacy, that same closeness, using different tools, different methods?
That's a much more nuanced question. And some studies do show that on the surface, men and women want similar things from friends.
Yeah, studies find both want intimacy, closeness. They have similar numbers of friends, spend similar time with them. The desire seems pretty universal.
But the how is different.
That's where the differences often appear. Men often prefer doing something together, finding friends who like the same activities. Women often prefer talking, finding friends who feel the same way about things.
And women do tend to talk more about personal stuff.
Research suggests they're about twice as likely to bring up personal issues. But, and this is important when it comes to supporting each other through tough times, like relationship problems, men and women are actually remarkably similar in how they offer and respond to that support.
Okay, but what about the researchers who doubt what men say? Who think men say they're open, but actually aren't.
Yeah, that's a tricky area. Some researchers hear a man say he talks about sex, horses, guns, and the army with his friend and conclude, see? No real emotional depth.
But that conclusion might be missing something.
It might be missing the kind of trust involved. Talking about sexual fears or insecurities, or the intense emotions from combat, terror, shame, exhilaration that requires immense vulnerability and trust. It might not sound like stereotypical sharing feelings, but it's deep disclosure nonetheless. We might be judging it by the wrong standard.
A different kind of vulnerability. That's a really important point. Still, other researchers, like Lillian Rubin, after interviewing hundreds of people, did find consistent differences.
Rubin's work is significant. She found women consistently reporting more friendships and deeper ones, defined by things like shared intimacy, self-revelation, nurturing, emotional support.
And men's friendships.
More often characterized by those shared activities. Conversations centered on external things, work, sports, hobbies, areas of expertise.
And the best friend numbers were striking too, weren't they?
Very. 3/4 of the women could easily name a best friend, but over 2/3 of the men couldn't. And even when they could, Rubin felt they shared little about the interior of their lives and feelings.
So if your definition of intimacy hinges on understanding someone's inner world through talking about thoughts and feelings,
Then, from that perspective, Rubin concluded men's friendships often seem emotionally impoverished. Other research backs this up, women sharing feelings more, preferring face-to-face interaction, men more side-by-side, women's friendships seen as person-oriented, men's as activity-oriented.
it seems technology even plays a role here, like the telephone.
It does, interestingly. Women often use the phone as a key tool to maintain friendships, especially over distance. Men, they tend to see it as more impersonal, preferring the shared activity. They use the phone less for that kind of relational maintenance.
And the potential downside of that.
Is that men's friendships might fade more easily over time if they rely heavily on shared activities that become harder to maintain. One researcher described the pain of men's loneliness and gradually accumulating disillusionment as these ties weaken.
That's a sobering thought. These differences seem to line up with common sense, which makes them feel very real, very fixed.
And that's the danger, right? It makes it easy to slip back into the different planets thinking. But these differences often tell us less about inherent gender and more about other life factors.
Like work, marriage, age,
Yeah.
race, all that stuff.
Exactly. We have to be careful not to overstate gender differences by ignoring everything else. You can't just compare working men to stay-at-home mothers and say, aha, gender difference. Their daily lives, their social opportunities are vastly different.
So the context matters hugely.
Absolutely. To really get friendship, you need the whole picture. The social environment, economic factors, not just male or female in a vacuum. Gender interacts with everything else.
And when you actually control for some of those other factors or look closer.
The picture changes. One major review concluded there's much more similarity than dissimilarity in how men and women do friendship. The differences that exist are not great, and they shrink, even vanish, the closer and longer lasting the friendship is.
So deep down, maybe we're not so different after all.
It looks that way. When asked what they value in a best friend, men and women list the same things: communication, intimacy, trust. And most people still choose a same-sex best friend.
What about self-disclosure? That seemed like a big difference.
The actual measured differences are often very small. Men's friendships are built on things like continuity, dependability, shared understanding, compatibility stuff that doesn't always require constant talk to maintain. But they also involve self-revelation, fun, shared lives, just like women's.
So maybe the issue is how we're measuring intimacy. If we only count feminine styles.
Then men's ways become invisible. Men often express intimacy through actions doing favors, friendly competition, joking, physical pats on the back, sharing achievements, just including each other in things. It's often more covert, embedded in the activity.
And things like phone use. Maybe it's not just gender, but how men view the phone itself.
Could be. Maybe for men who use phones for work all day, friendship is an escape from the phone. And research shows men are just as likely to defend friends, ask for help, go out of their way. And women value traditionally masculine friendship traits like loyalty and reliability just as much.
Which brings us back to looking at gender in combination with other factors, like that example of comparing working men and housewives.
Right. Working outside the home changes friendship dynamics dramatically for both men and women. Workplace demands, family roles, these can shape social ties just as much as gender.
And life stage matters too. People working outside the home might get intimacy needs met at home and seek sociability from friends.
While someone primarily at home with young kids, still mostly women might need friends for that adult intimacy and self-disclosure because kids can't provide that. So their friendship needs and opportunities look different. It's complex.
And race and class add another layer of complexity.
Absolutely. Racism, for example, profoundly shapes Black men's friendships, sometimes leading to a kind of protective impassivity, other times to highly expressive styles as a way to cope with societal injustice.
So what looks like a cultural trait might actually be an adaptation.
Exactly. Friendship becomes a survival tool, a me and him against the world kind of bond. And class intersects, too. Working class Black men's friendships can be incredibly close and self-disclosing, often built around shared politics.
Whereas upwardly mobile Black men might have fewer, less intimate friends.
Sometimes, yes. Perhaps reflecting assimilation of more mainstream, less expressive masculine norms, it really highlights how fluid these things are.
Age and marital status play a role too.
Definitely. Unmarried men often have closer friendships than married men. And again, when you control for things like closeness and duration, those big gender differences often melt away. Close, long-term friends, male or female, tend to be pretty similar in how they relate.
Okay, so it's way more nuanced than Mars versus Venus. But there are some areas where gender differences seem more pronounced, right? Especially around sexuality.
Yes, that's a big one. Sexuality complicates friendships in distinct ways for men and women. Let's start with cross-sex friendships.
Ah, the when Harry met Sally dilemma. Sex always gets in the way.
And Harry wasn't entirely wrong. Kimmel confirms sexual tension is pretty much inevitable in heterosexual cross-sex friendships. It doesn't mean they can't be friends, but...
It takes more work, more navigation.
Exactly. It makes the friendship potentially more fragile. Rubin's interviews found that tension almost universally present.
It creates that weird linguistic thing too, just a friend versus not wanting to ruin a friendship.
Right. Are friends less important than lovers? Or more important? And interestingly, it's often women who try harder to keep friendship and sexual attraction separate, while men might be more inclined to see them merge.
Why is that?
Well, partly because for men, emotional vulnerability is often linked to sexual relationships with women. So disclosing deep feelings to a male friend can feel uncomfortable, less familiar, which leads them to feel more comfortable opening up emotionally to women friends.
Which brings us to the other big gender difference. Homophobia.
A massive factor. Kimmel calls it a central organizing principle for men's same-sex friendships, but says it's virtually non-existent for women in the same way.
And it's not just about hating gay people, right? It's more subtle.
Much more subtle for many men. It's the fear of being seen as gay. Think about all the ways men might police their own behavior, how they walk, talk, dress, touch friends, just to avoid giving off the wrong impression.
So needing another man, caring deeply, being emotionally vulnerable, those things become suspect under traditional masculinity.
Precisely. It makes male friendship itself something that needs justification, explanation. That's why you get phrases like no homo or the focus on bromances, ways to frame male closeness that try to diffuse any perceived homosexual undertones.
It limits things so much.
Hugely. Stuart Miller, who wrote a book on male friendship, said people constantly assumed his book was about homosexuality. Lillian Rubin found the same as Sen. The association is incredibly common among men. It restricts physical affection, like hugging, men saying it wouldn't be rugged. It's a real social constraint.
What about friendships among gay men and lesbians? Does sexual orientation override gender patterns?
Interestingly, often not. Surveys show gay men and lesbians value close, intimate friendships similarly. They define intimacy similarly, behave similarly with friends in many ways. Big similarities.
But there are differences.
Key differences pop up around sex and conflict. Gay men are generally far more likely to sexualize their same-sex friendships than are lesbians. Lesbians, much like straight women, often have intensely close friendships completely separate from sex.
So gender patterns seem to persist even within the LGBTQ+ community.
Largely, yes. It suggests gender is often a more powerful shaper of intimate experience than sexual orientation itself.
And cross-sex friendships within that community.
Gay men tend to report more cross-sex friends than lesbians do. Lesbian circles are often predominantly female, straight or gay. Gay men's friends often include straight women and other gay men.
And there's that idea of friends as family.
Yes, very important for many gay men and lesbians. Sometimes born of necessity, if biological families aren't accepting, but also a chosen way of building supportive networks. Friends truly become family.
Okay, so these persistent differences, sexual tension, homophobia, the patterns in LGBTQ plus friendships, they really push us to find deeper explanations than just men and women are different.
Exactly. Those simple explanations are just circular reasoning. We need something more.
Which leads us to psychoanalytic perspectives, like Chodorow or Rubin.
Right. They connect the dots between how we're parented, the developmental tasks of childhood, and the cultural messages about masculinity and femininity. They argue this mix creates deep psychological differences between women and men that play out in intimacy.
Can you briefly explain that developmental path difference again?
Sure. The core idea is that boys, to become men in our traditional model, have to separate more sharply from their mothers, who are usually the primary source of early love and nurture. They learn to downplay dependence and emotional connection to assert masculinity. This can create a split where emotional intimacy feels separate from, or even opposed to, sexual excitement later on.
Whereas girls maintain more connection with the mother.
Generally, yes, leading to more continuity between early emotional bonds and later intimate relationships. For girls, emotional connection often forms the basis for sexual intimacy rather than being separate.
So the takeaway is, separation is harder for women, connection is harder for men.
That's the crux of it. Women stay more connected to attachment needs. Men learn to suppress them more. It sounds compelling, and it explains some things.
But it have limitations.
Yeah.
Especially cross-culturally.
Big time. Anthropologists point to societies where men undergo intense separation rituals from mothers, but are still seen as having deeper emotional lives and more intimate male friendships than women. So, early development can't be the whole story. Biology and psychology always happen within a specific culture and historical moment.
Which means we need to zoom out even further, to those big societal shifts.
Exactly. Those psychoanalytic ideas make more sense when you see them as part of this massive historical transformation around the turn of the 20th century in the West. Society and personality shape each other.
You mentioned several components. Let's recap them. First, industrialization.
Right. Separated home and work. Men went into competitive workplaces where vulnerability was a liability. They learned instrumental relationships, companionship, commitment, maybe, but not deep disclosure. Romantic male friendships faded.
Second, the separation of spheres.
Left women as the domestic experts, including emotional experts. Men focused on public traits like rationality, women on private virtues like nurturing. It divided the whole social and mental world.
Third, this led to femininity being equated with intimacy.
Yes, which exaggerated the differences. Importantly, these differences weren't the cause of things like women being excluded from work. They were the result. Inequality created differences that then justified the inequality. Catch-22.
Fourth, the rise of companionate marriage.
The ideal of marrying for love and emotional devotion. Crucially, this fused sexual passion and deep friendship within marriage for the first time, really. Remember, the Greeks kept them separate. Big shift.
And finally, the birth of the modern homosexual as an identity.
Yes, Foucault's point. As homosexual became an identity, not just a behavior, homophobia intensified. Men felt pressure to constantly prove their difference from women and gay men. This widened the perceived gender gap in intimacy.
So all these forces working together, industrialization, separate spheres, companionate marriage, homophobia, they created the stage on which we experience intimacy today.
That's Kimmel's argument. This whole setup, this division into gender domains, is fundamental to our gendered society and how we relate.
Okay, let's pivot specifically to love now. Because that separation of spheres hit love hard too.
Definitely. And again, the key is that love has a history. What it means, how we express it, that changes.
And today, like with friendship, women are often seen as the love experts.
Right. Advice columns, the whole cultural narrative, which means, as Francesca Cancian argues, men's behavior gets measured with a feminine ruler.
Devaluing their ways of showing love, like providing, protecting, practical help, even sexual passion.
Exactly. Those get sidelined in favor of the feminine emphasis on talking about feelings, emotional dependence, verbal nurturing.
But love wasn't always defined that way. You mentioned the troubadours.
Yeah, they sang of passion, but it was seen as disruptive, dangerous even. Later centuries advised against passion for marriage. Then it softened to affection, but practicality still ruled.
It wasn't until the 19th century that love became expected.
Pretty much. First, it was seen as something that developed within marriage. Only later did it become the main reason to marry, especially for the middle class.
So this idea of love being the absolute foundation for marriage, sex, family, it's actually quite recent and not universal.
Not at all. And interestingly, Kansi notes that love and sex are most strongly linked in cultures with more gender inequality, where women are more dependent. Where there's more equality and mutual dependence, they're often less tightly connected.
Fascinating. So how did this play out in gendered love, American style?
Well, from the mid-19th century on, love got defined by tenderness, emotion, maybe even powerlessness. It became woman's business, centered in the home.
Well, the man's world, the workplace, demanded emotional suppression.
Right. Home was the refuge, the place for interchange of affection, and women were the ministers of love. This feminization of love exaggerated the differences, just like with friendship.
Making men and women feel like intimate strangers, as Carol Tavris put it.
Exactly, because society expects, even requires, women to express certain emotions and men to suppress them.
That he said, she said example from Lillian Rubin really captures it, doesn't it?
Yeah.
The husband showing love by providing, the wife needing him to share his feelings.
It perfectly illustrates those different ways of loving that emerge from this gendered system.
And yet, empirical research throws some curveballs here too.
Oh, yeah. Just like with friendship, when you actually measure attitudes and experiences, men and women look surprisingly similar on many aspects of love. One review found similarity on most counts. Both genders are pretty equally emotionally expressive overall.
But the stereotypes get contradicted sometimes, like
Yeah.
who's more romantic?
Right. Common wisdom says women are the romantics. But research often finds men are stronger believers in romantic ideals, love at first sight, falling in love faster.
But they also fall out of love faster.
Often, yes. It's this paradoxical pattern. Men seem drawn to the spontaneous, overwhelming idea of romantic love, maybe like Casanova suggested, you don't desire what you already possess.
While women are more pragmatic about falling in love, but maybe experience it more intensely once they're in it.
That seems to be the trend. Women are more likely to like the person they love and really dive into the euphoric, idealizing parts of being in love.
More counterintuitive findings. Women initiate most breakups.
Yep. And they seem to find it easier to stay friends with exes.
And men struggle more afterwards. More loneliness, depression.
That's what studies often report, especially after breakups or divorce. And think about health outcomes. Married men generally do better than single divorced men, but for women, unmarried women are often happier and live longer than married women. It challenges simple narratives.
Have these gender gaps in attitudes towards love changed over time?
Dramatically. Remember that study from the 60s asking if you'd marry without love?
Men mostly said no. Women were more likely to say yes, possibly due to economic reasons.
Exactly. But repeat that study in the 80s and 90s, almost everyone, men and women, said, no way. Marriage without love became unthinkable.
Especially for women, reflecting their increased economic independence thanks to feminism.
Precisely. They gained the luxury of marrying purely for love, just like men had.
And culture plays a huge role too, right? Comparing U.S. attitudes to, say, Japan or Russia.
Shows massive differences. Cultural norms about love and marriage can easily outweigh gender differences. Studies comparing American and Chinese students also found culture was a much bigger factor than gender in shaping attitudes towards romantic love and marriage.
Okay, one more fascinating study. Kathy Greenblatt's look at couples before marriage versus years later.
Oh, this one is mind-bending. Before marriage, she asked how they knew they loved each other and how they knew they were loved.
And it was a happy symmetry.
Perfect symmetry. Men knew they loved because they do extraordinary things for her. Women knew they were loved because men did those things. Women knew they loved because they nurtured and cared. Men knew they were loved because women nurtured and cared. Everyone felt loved in the way they expressed love.
Amazing. But 10 years later...
Everything flipped. Wives were sure they still loved their husbands, but doubted their husbands loved them. Husbands were sure their wives loved them, but doubted they still loved their wives.
Wow. So it looks like men fall out of love, just like the stereotype.
Yeah.
But Greenblatt argues it's about the structure of marriage.
Exactly. It's not necessarily that feelings changed, but the opportunities to express love in those original ways changed. Once you're married, living together, raising kids, those grand, extraordinary gestures men relied on are less frequent. So they might doubt their own love because their primary way of showing it is diminished.
While women's nurturing role might be enhanced by family life, making them feel secure in their own loving feelings.
Precisely. The structure of the modern nuclear family tends to support women's traditional expressions of love, but can inadvertently undermine men's. It's not about innate gender, it's about how our social arrangements shape our ability to express and feel love in the ways we've learned.
Which suggests we all need to learn more flexible ways of loving.
That's the implication. We need to expand our repertoire.
This leads us nicely to redefining intimacy. Some argue this whole feminization of love isn't actually great for women either.
Right. Carol Tavris argues it narrows women's focus onto finding Mr. Right, potentially diverting them from their own ambitions, while reinforcing myths about essential differences.
But Kantian offers a way forward, saying love doesn't have to be feminized.
Yes, her point is crucial. Men's ways, practical help, shared activities, physical presence are just as valid a part of love as expressing feelings. And focusing only on the feminine style obscures the fact that women also express love instrumentally and through shared activities.
We need to see the full range in everyone. Which brings us to her challenging question.
The one about who is more loving. The couple who talks constantly but rarely helps each other practically, or the couple who supports each other through crises and runs a household together but rarely talks deep feelings.
It really forces you to question your assumptions about what constitutes real love.
It does, and it points towards needing a broader, more universal definition of love, one that values individual growth, mutual support, and intimacy in all the diverse ways humans express them.
Qualities both men and women are perfectly capable of.
Absolutely.
So, wrapping this all up, love and friendship. They're fundamental to who we are, how we understand ourselves.
They really are. They give us identity, purpose, support. Our friends help us see the best in ourselves and accept the rest.
But these bonds are fragile, aren't they? Especially friendship, with no formal contract.
Incredibly fragile. It relies purely on the emotional connection, easily neglected. Love requires constant tending amidst life's chaos. Sex, even more fleeting sometimes.
So understanding how gender shapes and doesn't shape our emotional lives is critical for actually sustaining these vital connections.
Pretending we're from different planets is a dead end. Kimmel warns it just condemns us to needing translators and technical support for basic human connection.
Instead, we need to just be more open, reveal more of ourselves.
Yes. Learn to communicate across whatever perceived divides we have. We are capable of it. As E.M. Forster wrote, we're capable of sustained relations, not just sparks.
So the final thought for you, our listener, is this. How might embracing a truly universal understanding of intimacy, one that sees value in both talking and doing, feeling, and practical support, how might that change your own relationships, your expectations, your connections? Something to think about. Thanks for diving deep with us.